Welcome to this component-free screencast on postmodernist theories of social inequality. Now, traditionally, within sociology, a fundamental concept has been social class. So social class has been a concept right at the centre of sociological studies into social inequality, and it also used to be believed that social class was one of the main steering forces that influenced the way in which people constructed their identity. The postmodernist argument, however, is that social class has lost its significance. And the reason for this is that postmodernists argue that society has moved away from being one based on production, where people's identity was closely tied to their job, their occupation, and now we've moved to a society which is much more individualistic and much more centred on consumption. And the German social theorist Ulrich Beck has even claimed that social class is essentially a zombie category. In other words, it's a concept that is past its sell-by date but refuses to lay down and die. Now, the essence of postmodernist thinking is that in economically developed nations such as the UK, we now live in a significantly different society to the previous modern one, which was based on production and industrialisation. And so great is the difference, postmodernists argue we can now talk of a distinctly new type of society called postmodernity. And such a society, according to this perspective, is characterised by being individualistic and is really centred around the importance of consumption and choice. Writers influenced by postmodernism argue that we shouldn't see social stratification and inequality only or even mainly in terms of economics and employment, that instead we should view inequality much more in relation to cultural factors such as people's lifestyle and their patterns of consumption. And this is sometimes referred to as a cultural turn in stratification research. So the argument here is that contemporary societies are marked by the significance of symbols and markers of consumption which play a greater role in daily life. So from this perspective, individual identities to a large extent revolve around people's lifestyle choices, such as how we dress, what we decide to eat, how we care for our bodies, where we relax, our hobbies and our pastimes, and less around the conventional class indicators, such as the type of work that we do. So whereas previously the nature of an individual's work or job would have defined their status and their position in society, from a postmodernist approach there is now much more interest in what people purchase and how they spend their leisure time. And it's believed from this perspective that through their consumption choices people construct their own identity. And of course the short-term and precarious nature of many people's experiences of employment means that people are unable to construct an occupational identity or story about themselves based on their work. One writer who illustrates these views is Zygmunt Bauman. And Bauman argued that countries such as the UK are more accurately referred to today as consumer societies rather than as industrial societies because people's identity is increasingly based much more on what they buy than on the job that they do. So for this reason, the concept of social class that has traditionally been based on indicators like people's jobs, like people's occupations, has lost lots of its relevance. And Bauman argues that subcultures based on social class have allegedly been replaced by a multiplicity of lifestyle groups that are based around consumption. And of course, this is essentially the same type of argument that we encountered last year when we looked at the topic of youth cultures. So one of the arguments that we looked at last year was the view that we've seen a move away from traditional youth subcultures based on a particular social class towards this concept of neo-tribes, where you've got participants drawn from very diverse backgrounds but with a loose attachment to a particular style and particular forms of consumption. Now, Bauman called those people that are able to consume in an active and effective way the seduced. And in this group he included both the wealthy and also those with less well-paid jobs but with access to credit, which enabled them to engage in conspicuous consumption. Those that are not able to consume effectively, Bauman called this group the repressed. And in this group he included not only those on low wages and long-term welfare, but also other people who might not be able to consume effectively for other reasons, such as the disabled, the elderly, and some ethnic minority groups. And from Bauman's perspective, a lot of consumption is status driven, because status or value is conferred by the way in which you spend your money in this consumer society. And if you look at a lot of marketing and a lot of the reasons why people buy particular goods and services, it's increasingly the case that goods are bought solely for their show-off or symbolic value rather than their intrinsic or use value. Now, a similar argument is also presented by the Australian sociologists Han Pakowski and Malcolm Walters. So these Australian writers argue that consumerism has become the dominant feature of postmodernity, and that social classes have become replaced by lifestyle groups that are linked to particular forms of consumption. So from this perspective, concentrating on social class is unhelpful, because societies are changing from class societies towards ones where stratification, where people's social position is primarily cultural. So this perspective is arguing that societies are increasingly organised around differences, but differences that are related to people's lifestyles, to aesthetics, to particular patterns of consumption. In other words, people's status in society might have a lot more to do with the things that they buy, the hobbies and interests that they take part in, rather than the job that they do. And these differences of status are reflected in fragmented and complex identities that are fluid and constantly changing and evolving. Now, this postmodernist view of social inequality is heavily criticised by most mainstream sociologists. So most sociologists would strongly argue that economic divisions within society remain of paramount importance. And many sociologists would argue that the British class system is becoming more and more polarised, and that there is a growing divide between a rich elite and the lower classes at the bottom of society. And furthermore, for the most part, people at the bottom of society who are experiencing extreme social and material deprivations are not doing so as part of a lifestyle choice. We cannot understand this purely from the perspective of culture. Instead, their circumstances are constrained by factors that relate to the economic and occupational structure of society. And in the present period, when the economy is still recovering from the recent recession, from the rapid global economic downturn that happened after the banking crisis, lifestyle choices may be increasingly constrained by people's economic situation and their social class position.